Well, hello, my anxious friends. Keep calm and wash your hands. This is episode 57 of Stand Up with Pete Dominic. Hey guys, thank you very much for joining me today, and I know that many of you are really anxious. I asked a question last night on Twitter. How are you feeling and dealing with coronavirus? And I'll share some of your answers in a moment here. But joining me on the show today is historian Kenneth C. Davis. I wanted to give you some perspective on how bad an epidemic or a pandemic can get, and we are not going to get anywhere near what happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu. And I've learned in my life with my situation that perspective matters. And I'm hoping actually that this doesn't scare you, my conversation with Ken, but it gives you a historical perspective on how much worse things were and certainly could be. So that's coming up. My guest, Kenneth C. Davis, but lots going on with the coronavirus or COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. How are you dealing with it? That is my big question. Airlines have dropped flights to South Korea. Iran is temporarily releasing 54,000 inmates to avoid spread in prisons. The Pope Francis, tests negative as cases have jumped in Italy. Still no word on the other Pope, if he's been tested. I just always think it's hilarious that there's two popes running around. The United States has now over 100 cases, with, of course, a big increase in expected. But we're number 10th, by the way. Number 9 is Singapore, 8 Spain, 7 Germany, 6 France, 5 Japan. Then number 4 is Iran, Italy, South Korea. Number 1 is China. But apparently China is seeing a decline in the reported infections. The World Health Organization has examined the data and believes the decline in coronavirus cases in China since the end of last month is real. The agency says with similar aggressive containment measures, other countries could also see a decline. Will we see a decline? How are you dealing with it? What are you thinking about it? And how much is it affecting you? Your work, your family, your life? Jessica Valenti tweeted, anyone else worrying about how the health of candidates are going to hold up re-coronavirus? Like all these seniors who are out there shaking hands with thousands of people. I like Richard Engel over there at the NBC News. Richard Engel tweeting the other day, don't panic, doctors and virologists I'm speaking to say 98% of the people will be fine, even if they get COVID-19. They expect it will go around the world, but that most people who get it will be a little sick, then recover. The danger is to vulnerable people, hospitals, and old age homes. He also tweeted, 2 virologists I've spoken to say coronavirus is not an end of days type virus. They say that you should take precautions, work for a vaccine, but emphasize this isn't the big one. And finally, Richard Engel spoke with Anthony Fauci, the U.S. Director of Infectious Diseases. He did like an hour-long interview with him on NBC. He also asked, by the way, Fauci, if he was being muzzled in any way by the Trump administration, who it was reported canceled a whole bunch of appearances that he was supposed to make, and I think sent Mike Pence. Sending Mike Pence to clean up any kind of a mess seems like it's going to be more of a mess after he's done with it. Doesn't it seem that way? Anyway, here's a little clip from the hour-long special of Richard Engel talking to Dr. Fauci.
What should the public know? People are scared. Right. When you ride the subway, and somebody coughs right now. Right. You can see the fear on people's face. Are they right? If somebody's coughing on the bus, should you get off?
No. Getting off is not going to help.
What about sporting events? What about concerts?
You see, that is called mitigation. We are not at the stage right now of mitigation for this. It may come to a point where when you have enough community spread that you switch from trying to contain it from coming into the country or contain it from spreading and trying to protect yourself and your community. We're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but are we going to get there? By the way, can you imagine being on the bus and someone coughing and you're just like, it's my stop. Thank you. Good luck with that. I'm out of here. All right, anyway, that was Richard Engel on NBC News with Anthony Fauci. Go check that out. Thanks to them for that. Okay, there are a few more things I want to read and some of your tweets. Here is Washington Post data reporter Christopher Ingram says social pressure can play a role here too. If your coworker is sick and he looks like death, tell him and encourage him to go home. The worst thing you could do is praise him for his commitment to creating value for shareholders or whatever. Yeah, good point, Chris. And your answers to the question I asked on Twitter at Pete Dominic. How are you feeling in dealing with coronavirus? Jose is a big Trump supporter that follows me and is always needling me. And he tweeted, I feel great knowing that real Donald Trump is in charge. No worries here. I mean, the thing about what is happening in America right now that is apparently the most upsetting and the most frightening is that we're completely unprepared for it. And there are a lot of different reasons that people are blaming, but a lot of it is President Trump dismissing and defunding the organizations, the CDC and the doctors and professionals that work in the White House and work in the government that are supposed to be preparing for biothreats and pandemics. And let's see, the CDC guidance is announced by Vice President Pence today. Doctors will have full clinical discretion to order tests. Okay, well, that's great, but there also has been a real shortage of testing kits, and that seems to be the outrage of a whole lot of people. And yeah, I think that's important. Trump's obsessed with and focused on a vaccine, but that really doesn't help anything short term, and there's no sign of a vaccine anytime soon, maybe for next year. The White House had a briefing on today on the virus, but no audio or video was allowed. And let's see, what other reactions do I have from you? I got sidetracked there reading some other stuff. Okay, your answers to the question, how are you feeling and dealing with coronavirus? Matt writes, flew back from India on a business trip last week. There seemed to be very little concern there, even though they are much closer to the source. Saw some masks and concerned folks connecting through Paris. Lots more freaked out people once I got back to the States. I'm not saying we shouldn't be worried, but I found it interesting how different countries' cultures responded to it. This is my anecdotal experience too, so take it for what it's worth. Personally, I believe things will all calm down, but it's irresponsible to be unprepared. Oh, by the way, yeah, the Fed cut the interest rate a whole half point today, which was really shocking. The market bounced back and then started dropping again, is my understanding. So that's a big story. Sean Patton on Twitter says, mildly nervous, but not changing any daily habits or hoarding food supplies would be a great bit better without morally bankrupt and incomplete leadership. My friend Tina says, just keeping an eye on the news, following Dr. May. Dr. Megan May, of course, has been joining me a lot. Feeling absolutely no panic or worry as of yet. Good for you, Tina. Cycling for Cures on Twitter. Strictly looking at it from a disruption to global supply chains. Personally, I'm not worried for myself, but concerned for my parents and grandparents. Ellie Mistal says he's increasingly terrified. At Street Spirit NYC, what if they're lying to us? And we know they're lying to us. What? Chum, the Chum Man, who joined me on the big Super Tuesday Spectacular on yesterday's podcast, or number 56. He says, if there's one event that can speed up the authoritarian trajectory we're on and a likely reason for martial law to be declared by the Trump administration, this is it. Terrified citizens will give up freedom for security and news networks will delight showing the carnage. Ooh, Chum. Good point. Interesting point. We'll see if that is actually the case. I hope not. Matthew says, literally the background plot for V for Vendetta. Joby says, my wife has a lung infection and had to fly through Spokane through Seattle today. You could say, I'm concerned. And a lot more responses if you want to check out my that tweet. Dennis said, I have a sinking feeling that ultimately we all will know at least one person who dies from this. Dennis, I don't think that's the case. Marie said, I bought about 6 pounds total of various types of beans and a couple of pounds of rice. Also, I got a bottle of liquid Band-Aid. It's great for healing cracks if you wash your hands a lot, or if you wish your hands a lot. Other than that, I'm doing what I did for flu season. Leighton says he's trying not to touch his face. Yeah, I tried not to touch my face for like 4 minutes today as an experiment today, and I found myself digging in the back of my throat with my finger, realizing that's not good. So, all right, well, a lot of great responses on the old Twitter machine, and keep them coming. And also keep those Patreon subscriptions coming. Over 360 people now paying for a subscription on Patreon. I announced to them at my page, can't see that announcement unless you're a paying subscriber, that I want to start advertising whatever they want me to advertise. If you're a Patreon subscriber here on the podcast, which gets over 3,000 listens per episode, you can advertise. I'm going to plug whatever your product or your service is. I don't care if you sell tooth implants, sex toys, your services of some sort, you sell clothes on eBay, you want me to plug the account, or if you want me to plug somebody else's book or idea or nonprofit organization, anything that they're doing, anything you basically want me to say if you are a Patreon subscriber, I am going to consider it. And that's one of many new things that I'll be offering to Patreon subscribers, including, of course, my friendship, regular conversations, and much, much more. So go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick or check out the link in the show notes or go to PeteDominick.com and you can find it there. Okay, so I know that the Super Tuesday happened, and I'm going to have a special spectacular on that with a whole bunch of different smart political types and pundits and maybe some comedians that I might post Thursday, I might post Friday, I don't know. But who do you want to hear on the Super Tuesday post spectacular, as well as some of those guys that joined me on Tuesday? A lot of great feedback that I had. 4 listeners, 3 listeners joining me in a conversation that I dropped on Tuesday. I might even drop a podcast every day this week. So, I don't know. There's just so much to talk about, and I have access to all these people, and I can just call and press record, and why should I keep that to myself? I want to share it with you. Okay, so Kenneth C. Davis is one of my favorite historians. Follow him on Twitter at Kenneth C. Davis and go to don'tknowmuch.com and get all of his books. Don't know much about the Bible, don't know much about Civil War, geography, history, don't know much about the American presidents, Americans' hidden history, don't know much about mythology, and this one, More Deadly Than War. That is a book that we are going to talk about today. 100 years ago, the world was living through twin catastrophes, the final months of the Great War and the most deadly global outbreak of disease since the Black Death. My conversation with Kenneth C. Davis, giving you some historical perspective. It's not nearly as bad now as it was then. You are going to be okay. That I want to be able to tell you. Most of us are going to be okay. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about those who are more vulnerable and doing our best to keep our hands clean and stay home if you are feeling ill and covering your face and all of that. Think about those who are most vulnerable because it could be someone that you care about, someone that you love, or you. And now let's get to my conversation with today's guest, Kenneth C. Davis, historian and author of the book we're talking about today, More Deadly Than War. Good. Okay, well, I've got my favorite historian now. I just told you all about his books and where to get them, and I wanted to talk with him about pandemic because he wrote a very important book called More Deadly Than War, which I've told you about, and obviously the word pandemic back in the news. Everybody is panicking. And I thought one way to look at it would be to get a historical perspective. And anytime I want to get a historical perspective on anything, I go to my favorite historian. Kenneth Davis joins me now, and I'm very happy to have you on the podcast for the first time. I wish it wasn't about a pandemic, but great to see you and have you. Thank you.
It's great to be with you, Pete. Thanks for having me. And before we start anything about this whole subject of pandemic and viruses and the Spanish flu, which I wrote about, took place in 1918. I want to be very careful and say I am a historian. I am not a doctor. I'm not going to give medical advice. I'll give the advice that the CDC is giving, but I just want to make it clear that that's my disclaimer here, that this is historical accuracy and important lessons from history. That's the reason we study history in the first place, but I just feel like I need to make that disclaimer right up front.
Well
so
done.
Thank you.
How professional of you. And we will have plenty of other medical experts, I will, and already have to talk about that. But obviously, we wanted to get the historical perspective. Let's talk about the Spanish flu. This is 1918?
That's correct.
17? Why the Spanish flu? And there does seem to be some controversy of where its origins were.
That's right. Let me set the table here that the United States did not enter what we call World War I until 1917. And the reason I'm talking about World War I instead of the flu to start with is because everything about the Spanish flu, the pandemic, the Great Flu of 1918, as it's also called, has to do with the fact that there was a global war going on. It was the first globalized war, and that had a lot to do with the spread of what became known as the Spanish flu. So the United States declares war in 1917. The European countries have all been fighting since August of 1914. Of course, the Tsar of Russia, the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany had already all said in 1914, this will be over in 6 months. The boys will be home before the leaves turn on the trees. They'll be home in time for Christmas. Wrong. There were 1 million men dead within the space of about 6 months once what we call World War I began. So the war goes along. The United States finally enters in 1917 for a variety of reasons. We don't need to go into that right now. And then we had to really start from scratch with getting an army ready because the United States did not have an army, did not really have a navy to speak of in 1917. So a really quick ramp up of preparedness to send 1 million young soldiers over to Europe very fast. One of the things they did was set up camps all around the country. They were called cantonments, what we would call boot camp in a sense. And in the spring of 1918, March into April, tens of thousands of young men, mostly young men, of course there were some women doing service-related things as well, were crowded into camps all over the country. And that's when they started to notice a strange flu. An influenza outbreak. They didn't all call it influenza. Some people called it the grip, very old-fashioned word for a bad cold.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the grip. Some people called it catarrh. There were different words for it. One thing I have to say here is that even though the word influenza had been around for a long time, and people identified influenza going back to the time of Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine in ancient Greece, nobody had ever seen a virus. Viruses were too small to be seen by the microscopes of the period. Oh. They had seen bacteria, which are much, much larger than viruses, but no one knew actually what a virus was. So they start to see in these camps where 10, 20, 50,000 young soldiers are crowded together in barracks and tents in the cold, they're starting to see a flu go around that's unusual. Because some of these rather healthy, strapping young farm boys were dropping dead in a matter of days. They were coming into sick bay. They were turning blue, literally blue. In fact, they called this first the purple death because these young men were turning blue because they were losing oxygen. Yikes. And they were dying. So they called it the purple death. They couldn't explain this. And what happened was, as these guys then got onto trains, and the trains were crowded, took them to ships, and the ships were crowded, the ships took them to Europe. About 1 million young American servicemen, the doughboys as they were known, land in France by May of 1918, and this virus then, this tremendous flu virus, spreads around Europe. It's so extensive, in fact, by the time, by May, for instance, the ships of the English fleet couldn't sail. Too many sailors were sick. So this did have an impact on the not necessarily the outcome of the war, but what was happening during the war. The German army was trying to mount a major offensive at the time that the Americans were still landing. They wanted to push the French and the British back before the Americans actually got there. They couldn't mount this offensive because 500,000 German soldiers were actually sick with the flu. They called it the Flanders fever. Flanders being one of the famous battlefields of this period of the trench war.
That's better than the grip. Well, so the Spanish flu swept the world just about the time Americans were entering what was then called Europe's Great War. And so that war and that pandemic will always be connected. But how many Americans died in that first year?
This is an astonishing number. 675,000 Americans died of the flu in about a year's time.
Good God.
Now, we had a bad flu season 2 years ago, and about 60,000 people died. This was 675,000. For some perspective, that was about the number of people who have died of HIV and AIDS in 40 years. It's also equal to about the number of Americans who died fighting in the world, in the wars of the 20th century. World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So this was an astonishing number. It swept America, and it swept the world. The numbers around the world are even more staggering, if anything. 50 to 100 million people, including 20 million people in India, it's believed, died over the course of a little more than a year from what was called the Spanish flu. Now, I'm sure you want to ask, why the Spanish flu, don't you?
I was just going to ask you, Professor, why did they call it the Spanish flu?
Again, it has to do with the war. Spain was a neutral nation during what they called the Great War back then. It wouldn't be called World War I until much later, obviously, when there was a World War II. So Spain was a neutral nation. And when Madrid gets hit by this epidemic in the spring of 1918, the King of Spain is deathly ill. They shut down the streetcar systems. You know, we've seen cities around the world right now shutting down transportation.
Just reading about one of our favorite places this morning. Have you read about Italy and how they're handling it right now? I know you love to go there.
We just returned from Milan about 6 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. So, that's Milan. That was the article I read in the New York Times.
So we know where we were in Parma, which is one of the other towns that's being hit. So we know that part of Italy very well, and we have friends there. And we're in.
Well, maybe we should quarantine you, sir.
We were there early enough that we were well away from this, but we're obviously taking precautions. But back to Spain for just a minute.
Thank you.
The Spanish were neutral in the war. What does that mean? It means that unlike Germany, the United States, France, Britain, there was no censorship of the newspapers, either self-censorship or government censorship. So the first real news of an outbreak of large proportions, epidemic proportions, comes out of Madrid, from the wire services in Madrid. And so because of that, Spain got dunked with this name, Spanish flu. Other countries did call it other things. The Germans called it the Bolshevik fever because they were afraid of the Bolsheviks. In Japan, it was called wrestler's fever for some reason. In South Africa, it was the white's disease or the black's disease, depending on which group you were in. Oh, is that
right? Wow.
So the name, that it did have different names around the world, but Spanish flu is the most widely and most well-known name now. But it's simply because Spain released the information. All of the other countries that were involved in the war were censoring the news. You didn't see reports of large numbers of people being sick, not for a while. And
that leads me to the next question, which you write about in your book, More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu in the First World War, Kenneth Davis, is what role did propaganda play in distorting the public's view of the outbreak, whether it be the American public, the European public, or anywhere else that this broke out, which is everywhere?
This is why it's a really great and important question, Pete. Thank you for that, because I
think we're seeing a lot of that today to some extent, certainly in China.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is why we study history in the first place, to try and make some useful lessons that we can learn something. Unfortunately, we often do not. So because... And again, the science has changed incredibly in 100 years. We have to be clear about that. Right. But there's still a lot of misinformation and unknowns about this particular virus. 100 years ago, there was a tremendous amount of ignorance and misinformation. As I said, they didn't really know what a virus was. They had the word virus, but no one had ever seen one. They wouldn't see it until about 20 years later when electron microscopes came along. So there's a lot of mystery, and mystery always leads to explanations that often have no basis in science. So some of the explanations were, this is just because the streets are dirty, or immigrants are bringing it in. Immigrants have always been blamed for bringing in disease, danger, and dirt. So the immigrant problem was part of it. Especially in a place like New York, where an Irish immigrant woman was known as Typhoid Mary because she had set off a typhoid scare a few years before. So that immigration part of the story is important. But there was also,
and we're seeing that now. I mean, you're seeing that with Chinese restaurants. You're seeing that with any of people with any Asian descent being targeted for discrimination, for name calling, for fear. I mean, just to bring it back to the present time. Go ahead.
Well, during the war, the fear was the Germans. So, was this a new weapon that the Germans had released, put on U-boats, their submarines, and brought over? Had they released germs in movie theaters in the United States? Of course, it was nonsense because this was going on around the world, and including in Germany, but a lot of people didn't know that because of censorship. So there was a tremendous fear that the Germans had done this, and this is also the era when chemical warfare begins in a real sense.
Right.
The mustard gas, the other kinds of gases that were being used on the battlefield. So chemical weapons were now a real thing in the world. So were the Germans doing this? And people did really believe this. You look at newspaper accounts and see that this is being blamed on German saboteurs. The other thing was that there was a company called Bayer. You know Bayer, they make aspirin. Well, Bayer was a German company. They invented aspirin or developed it at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a miracle drug for sure of the 20th century. But people began to wonder if Bayer, this German company, was doing something to aspirin to make people sick. They actually had to take out ads in the United States that said, Bayer is made by Americans in America.
Oh, wow.
So, and there was a lot of antagonism towards Germans in America at the time, and it was the kind of thing you look back on and laugh. They changed the names of Frankfurters. Just the way French fries were once called Liberty fries because we didn't like the French for a while in the United States. They stopped playing Beethoven on the radio. They stopped playing Bach on the radio. This was really an extraordinary moment when fear really did seize the country.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of parallels with that today. It's different.
So we had propaganda then, and we had censorship. The governments, as I mentioned, didn't want this news in the newspaper. Why? They didn't want people to panic, so they wanted to keep morale up in their countries,
right?
Because they were involved in a war effort. And what if people started to say, well, I'm not going to go to work anymore, and they needed war factories to keep going. So that was part of it. There was also the fact that they didn't want the enemy to know that they had been weakened. If the Germans know that we have a lot of sick people, maybe they'll step up their offensive. So those kind of considerations entered into this and took much greater priority over the public health at an enormous cost in public safety.
And you write about in your book how these patriotic parades played a part in fueling the epidemic. What's that all about?
Well, that's a really important one. And just to step back for a second and continue the chronology here, the flu, what we call the Spanish flu, it gets named in the spring of 1918. It seems to dissipate, and this is an important point today. People say, oh, well, the flu season's over.
Right.
What happened is that this flu, this virus, mutated to some degree and came back in the fall more violent, more virulent than ever, even more deadly. It had been bad in the springtime. It came back with a real vengeance in September. And what was going on because of the war, again, was that every city in America, certainly every big city in America, was supposed to meet a quota of selling what are war bonds. They called them Liberty loans then. This was a high-pressure, again, propaganda campaign to get Americans involved in paying for the war effort. was a very different way of going about it 100 years ago. So in Philadelphia, for instance, there had been one in Boston, and Boston was the first serious outbreak of Spanish flu in the fall of 1918. But there had been one of these parades, these patriotic parades, where guys who were sick getting off ships were marching around the streets of Boston. 2 days, 3 days later, Boston explodes with Spanish flu. In Philadelphia, at the end of September, they gave a parade that 200,000 people came to. Now, the health department was told, the head of the health department was told, don't let this parade go on. There's too much epidemic flu going around on the nearby army bases. There was a naval shipyard there, and a lot of this started in the military bases and moved into the civilian population. They said, no, we have to sell our bonds. This is too important. It's just the flu. It's just the grip, and we'll get over this in a few days. Well, 2 days after that parade, which was on September 28th in 1918 in Philadelphia, every hospital bed in Philadelphia, 75 hospitals, was filled. They had about 12,000 people die in about 3 or 4 weeks in Philadelphia. They couldn't keep up with the demand of the morgues. The undertakers couldn't keep up with demand. People were literally dropping dead on the street from this. Now, this was a very virulent, violent flu that also killed younger people in unusual numbers. That's one of the strange things about the Spanish flu. And, of course, so many young people were crowded together. As I said, ships transporting troops. The fact that these troops and supply ships were moving around the world is what made this take it from a localized epidemic to a true pandemic.
And I don't want to speculate in terms of the parallels. Neither do you. But we're talking about the war then, and now we have that kind of travel just on a normal basis for travel and business and tourism, and so that's how these pandemics spread. Not to mention trade and it just being a globalized economy. But putting that aside and getting back to your book and the Spanish flu of 1918, there are always some survivors that are famous, that lived through it, that talked about it. And I know that your book documents some of those famous people who survived the Spanish flu. Tell me who some of them were.
Well, two are really significant. Well, they're all significant in many respects, but two of the most significant that I point to is one is a 16-year-old kid in Chicago, and Chicago was a real bad spot for the flu because they had the biggest naval base in the world called the Great Lakes Naval Center. It was where all of the sailors were training. And then it was the place where all the trains come in. So Chicago was such an important port, naval facility, and then taking the railroads out around the rest of the country. So this young kid who wants to enlist because everybody wanted to get into a uniform, he's 16, the Army won't take him. The Red Cross will take him to be an ambulance driver if he's 17. So he fixes his birth certificate to say he's 17, goes to train for an ambulance as an ambulance driver, gets really sick, comes home, nearly dies. His name is Walt Disney. How the world would have changed. By the way, another famous ambulance driver from Illinois area who did get to the war, didn't get the Spanish flu, is Ernest Hemingway. And Ernest Hemingway talks about how deadly diseases were during the war in some of his famous books written about the war. But the other extraordinary case is, in many ways, even more extraordinary. A young undersecretary of the Navy gets sick in Europe, comes home to New York on one of the troop transports that is really notorious eventually as being a breeding ground for this virus to spread around.
Yeah, like the cruise ships of today. I'm sure it's similar to this.
It was more crowded in many respects than a cruise ship is, and certainly not with the cruise ship's amenities. This ship was called Leviathan. It was the largest passenger ship of its day. There were 11,000 soldiers crowded onto the ship. Well, this guy comes off the boat, and they put him right into an ambulance and take him to his mother's home, where about 6 weeks later he recovers, and it was touch and go for him. His name is Franklin D. Roosevelt. So think how history would change if Roosevelt had not survived.
Well, he had a lot of health challenges throughout his life then. I mean, he wasn't polio what crippled him?
That's right. He was later crippled by polio, and there is some speculation that there might be a connection. I cannot comment on that. I don't know. I just know that some people. I also should point out, one of the people who did die of the Spanish flu was a German immigrant who had been quite successful, and he dies on May 28th, I think, of 1918, and his name is Friedrich Trump.
That's Donald Trump's great-grandfather?
Grandfather. Donald Trump's grandfather drops dead in Queens in 1918. They called it pneumonia, but most likely he was a victim of the Spanish flu.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. So his grandfather may have been a victim of a strain of influenza, and now he's in charge.
There's no question that he died of pneumonia. Most of the pneumonia that was happening in 1918, because we say they died of the Spanish flu, usually it was the flu leads to other complications, pneumonia being chief among them. That's the reason why it's called the Purple Death, because people's lungs were filling up with fluid. And the reason that many people believe that it was affecting young people so viciously was that the younger you are, and the healthier you are, the more vigorous your immune system was. And this was like your immune system overreacting to this virus. And that's why young men, especially soldiers, later on many young women, especially nurses, people volunteering in the front lines as nurses, Salvation Army, Donut Sallies as they were known, they were dying in spectacular numbers because their immune system was healthy and responding so aggressively to this virus. That is the belief about how this virus killed so many ordinarily healthy young people who should survive the flu. The mortality rate, by the way, is around 2%. There's some question as to what the mortality rate of this current virus is.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to know because they have no idea how many people have been diagnosed, so it's hard to...
They don't know how many people actually have it.
Right.
They know how many people have died, but we can't really come up with
It's probably lower, a lot lower than 2%. At least that's the hope. What about just the general reaction? It's I think the most one of the most interesting things that is happening right now, Ken, is just watching people react to the fear of this around the world, from China to Iran to Europe, now to the United States and everywhere else. Talking to a friend in Australia where they have it, of course, it's everywhere. And different cultures and societies will react differently to things. But the one thing that connects us all, of course, now is social media. And so you're seeing the panic play out, certainly in a different way in 2020 than it did back then. But how did it change culture and society temporarily or permanently?
Well, first of all, I should say that the first image that one has to have when you come to think of the Spanish flu is that everyone was wearing masks. In many cities, you had to wear a mask. You couldn't get on a streetcar if you didn't have a mask. The masks then were gauze masks, spectacularly ineffective at stopping a virus, which are much too small to be stopped by a gauze mask. But you go back and look at images of policemen, firemen, postal workers, people at baseball games wearing these flu masks. They proved ineffective then. Today, we're hearing a lot of people talking about masks, and they're actually asking people not to buy masks because healthcare workers really need them. Yeah. And so they're trying to limit them to people who need them most. Their effectiveness at stopping influenza or a virus is limited depending on the type of mask it is and how you use it. You know, I've seen people on the subway as recently, or on the bus as recently as a few days ago, and one guy had his mask up on his head. So you'd obviously put it on and then probably got tired of wearing it and moved it up, and it was on his forehead.
It's like watching a cyclist ride a bike while holding his helmet in his hands.
Yeah, something like that. Or, you see somebody with a mask on, but then they reach up underneath the mask to scratch their nose. The big problem with mask is that you have germs on your hands and you're introducing them to your face. Right. Keeping your hands away from your face is one of the good ideas that they tell us. It's very hard with small children. Washing hands. Flu vaccine, all of these things are known to be powerful preventatives. And so we can do a lot more now because we understand so much more about the flu. Of course, there's no cure for the flu today, just as there was no cure in 1918. Back then, there were no vaccines. There's no vaccine for this current virus, but there are flu vaccines. And of course, many people will just get the normal flu this season and die from it. The fact that there's a different novel virus working at the same time as the usual flu season doesn't mean that the regular flu isn't any less dangerous than it always is.
No,
it's a lot less lethal, presumably, than this flu. But you still have to do the same things to take care of yourself.
Right, and hopefully that awareness will, in the long run, help people prevent other viruses. But
just to add on to your earlier point about the spread of fear, they didn't need social media for people to be afraid back then. The fear was very widespread because, again, you'd walk out on the street and you saw people dying on the street, literally falling down, dying on the street. In 1918, you saw families dead in their yards in places like Philadelphia. So the level of fear, one of the things they talk about almost everywhere you went, especially at the army bases, was the corpses are stacked like cordwood. Now, we don't see that, with this, certainly yet. But that's how bad it was in 1918, that they were piling bodies up because they couldn't deal with them fast enough. It's a horrific, frightening idea. It's Walking Dead material in some respects. But that's what it was like. So without any social media and even without television, radio was just coming into existence. But they had, massive newspapers at the time. This was, struck fear across the country. And people were paying attention to the news because the war was going on. So you had these twin things of the horrific war casualties and then more and more news of flu casualties. So people were absolutely afraid and uncertain of what to do.
Really, really important historical perspective. More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu and the First World War. And check out all of the work of Kenneth C. Davis at don'tknowmuch.com. Don'tknowmuch.com. Get all of his history books. I appreciate you joining me and taking a historical perspective at a really, really important and timely issue. And hopefully we don't get anywhere near as bad as we did over 100 years ago now.
Well, if we take care of ourselves and do some smart things, we should be able to fend off the worst of it. But it's good to understand the history and what history lessons have for us.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot, Pete.
Well, there you have it. Kenneth C. Davis on Twitter. Don'tknowmuch.com. Go get all of his books. Tell him that you heard him here. Support me on Patreon. You can find a link in the show notes to this podcast. That's patreon.com/Pete Dominic. And give us a rating and all of that on wherever you're listening to the podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. Tomorrow, maybe it'll be Friday. We'll see what happens. I've been pretty ambitious this week with the podcast, putting out an episode maybe every day. That's maybe the goal. I don't know. I don't know if it's going to be able to happen. I've got a life that I'm living, other things that I've got to do, and responsibilities to the girls. But I'm trying to get out a Super Tuesday reaction. We'll hear from different political analysts. Maybe I'll get my brother. Maybe I'll get some comedians, trying to round up a whole bunch of different opinions for that show. Thank you so much for listening. Really. If you're still listening right now, wow, awesome. Thank you. All the way through this episode. Who are you? Email me right now. Say, I listened all the way through. I'm the one. And I really appreciate the podcast. Say all of those things and whatever else you want. You can email me at standupwithpete@gmail.com. Be the change that you want to see in the world, and I will talk to you next time on the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast that I'm going to need you to tell your friends about. Thank you.